thanks. Can you hear me now? Okay, so let me tell you a little about how I came to write this book, which had a sort of unusual genesis. I don't know if you remember, a few years ago, there was a big volcano in Iceland that disrupted, you haven't seen nods here, it disrupted air travel all through Europe. I'm going to be sitting with a couple of friends, and we were talking about this because they were about to go to Europe and their flight got canceled. And one of them said, this is the sort of thing that I used to have anxiety dreams about when I was a child. And one of the other people there said, I'm from the Midwest, I wouldn't have dreams about volcanoes. All my anxiety dreams are about tornadoes. And I thought, so were mine. When I was growing up, I had recurring nightmares about tornadoes. And I started asking around sort of informally among my friends, and I discovered that all of my friends who were from the Midwest who remembered recurring dreams from their childhood dreamed about tornadoes. Now, I'm going back here. My own childhood was in the 1960s, and that was at a time where, this is before video footage of tornadoes. You can go online now to YouTube, and there's a whole genre of tornado footage, which they actually call torn porn, where you can see hour after hour, it's true, hour after hour of tornado footage. None of that existed when I was a child. You never heard about tornadoes. I mean, you never saw tornadoes. You heard about them constantly, but even seeing a clear photo of one was a really rare event. But it was part of the texture of our lives then, and we got tornado training in schools, for instance, what to do if a tornado came to your house. And we were told two things then that, I don't know, if you might have heard when you were a child. One was hide in the southwest corner of the basement. And yeah, there again, people are saying that. And the other is open all the windows. There again, yeah. Those things are the worst advice possible for doing a tornado. And they told us that, I think, because they were trying to give us a feeling that there was something we could do, when as far as people knew back then, there was really nothing. There's always a tendency, certainly among American governments and schools and institutions, to try to give people a feeling of empowerment when there's nothing to be empowered about. And this was part of why people had this advice about tornadoes. Now, those two pieces of advice are very interesting historically because they go back to the 19th century. Those weren't modern scientific views of tornadoes. Those were actually ideas that started getting floated around in the 1880s and have persisted. Some people still hear them today. And even though they're nonsense, and they were always nonsense, there was never any scientific reason to believe it. Well, to be fair, there was a kind of scientific notion that they were relied on. The advice about opening windows, for instance. People believed then, in the 19th century, the tornadoes were so extraordinarily destructive because the core of a tornado was a vacuum. And if it passed over your house, the air pressure inside your house would press outwards and would blow up your house. So you opened the windows to equalize the air pressure and your house would blow up. Now, here again, that's total nonsense. The tornadoes are not destructive for that reason. They're destructive because of the winds that are surround the funnel, which can travel at close to 300 miles an hour and can destroy just about anything on Earth. But there again, it was an idea that sounded good, and nobody knew anything better, so it just kept floating around and getting repeated, and people just simply believed it. And you hear beliefs like that today, for instance. People have this idea that if you're driving the open country and a tornado, you see a tornado, the best place to hide is under a freeway overpass. You can see people doing that. There's videos of people doing that. That's the worst place on Earth to hide from a tornado in open country, because the wind under an overpass, the overpass can act like a wind tunnel and actually speed the wind up. So a tornado that you might survive if you were out in an empty field, you hide under a bridge and you can get sucked into the funnel. The idea, for instance, or the idea about the southwest corner of the basement, for instance, came from an observation that most tornadoes move from southwest to northeast. So the idea was if you went to your basement and you hid in that corner, the tornado would strike it full on, and that might be more survivable than if you were hiding, say, in the northeast corner of the basement. I have friends who are a little younger than I am, who when they went to school, they were told, no, hide in the northeast corner. We've decided now that's safest. Not the southwest corner, the northeast. But that's also, it doesn't make any difference what corner of the basement you hide in. Actually, the truth is that almost everyone who's killed by tornadoes is killed by flying debris. So the best thing you can do is just hide somewhere that doesn't have a window. That's the safest place in any building to hide from a tornado. You need a supporting wall if there's one, if you're in a building that might collapse, but the idea that what corner of the basement is just a form of magic. Now, I'm making fun of scientists now, but one of the things I found when I was researching my book is that when people first came into the Midwest and didn't really know much about tornadoes, the Native Americans who lived in the prairie at the time when they were willing to give settlers advice, there was a time when they were willing. They changed their mind about that pretty quickly. But when they were willing to give settlers advice, they told people to build their settlements at the junction of rivers because tornadoes don't cross water. That's also totally false. So the tradition of bad expert advice on tornadoes goes back hundreds of years. Anybody who's lived in St. Louis, which is built at the junction of the two greatest rivers in America, knows perfectly well tornadoes can cross rivers with no problem whatsoever. You also hear things like tornadoes can come into the interior of cities. Also completely false. A tornado column is about 50,000 feet high, so the fact that a building might be 1,000 feet high, not going to make any difference. All of these ideas are floating around because people need to have a feeling that there's something they can do. Now, there's another way that governments have, the American government has traditionally made people feel better about tornadoes, and that was to refuse to talk about them at all. This is another thing that we've forgotten about the history of weather, but there was a period in America from the late 19th century until right after World War II where the National Weather Service forbid its forecasters from predicting tornadoes. They forbid its forecasters from even mentioning tornadoes. They said, they had actually two reasons. One which sounds okay and the other they didn't want to say. The first was that they thought, because it was impossible to predict tornadoes, that a prediction would cause a panic which might be worse than the actual tornado. Maybe. But the other reason was they were actually under a lot of pressure from business interests and real estate people in the Midwest who didn't want people to get the idea that the Midwest was dangerous. They didn't want people to be worried about tornadoes because then they wouldn't buy land. So they just refused to talk. And if they did talk about it, the head of the Iowa branch of the National Weather Service, and the 1890s said Iowa gets only one tornado a year.
Well, you guys live here. There's more than one tornado a year in Iowa. He also said people shouldn't build storm cellars, which is actually one of the few genuinely practical steps you can take for tornadoes, and especially if you live in farm country. He said they shouldn't build storm cellars because actually the danger from catching a cold from the storm cellar, from the dirt, was worse than any danger from any tornado. So all along through the history of America, people have had this strange, ambiguous relationship with tornadoes, denying them, being fascinated by them, but sort of pretending they weren't a big problem. And so that became, when I started researching this book, the thing that fascinated me the most was how did people discover tornadoes and how did we learn to live with them? And the discovery was curious because when the European settlers came to America, they had no idea at all what tornadoes were. They had never seen any, they had never read about any. It was a complete